Thank you very much. Is this too loud? No? It's okay. It's good. Nice. I'm going to take my glasses off because the only reason I put them on is to see you. And it's great to see you. It really is. You know, too much attention really disturbs my mind, so I actually have to tone it down, and I can see these people right here, and that's just, I can deal with that. Truly. 11 months. Yeah, before I start, I really want to start out by saying that rarely in my life have I ever gone somewhere or arrived somewhere and had the incredibly warm welcome. Really, in almost every interaction I've had since I arrived in Groningen. And so these have been a really, really amazing 11 months. And only a year ago, actually about a year and 3 months ago, I decided to found the foundation here in Groningen. Originally, I was going to do it in Amsterdam. But my friend Meerte convinced me to come and visit. And I came, and 24 hours later, I said, that's it. I've changed my mind. It's going to be Groningen. And I'm very, very glad that I did. Thank you for your welcome, really, truly. So, what they don't teach you about your thinking. I'd like to start out at the beginning of this story. Because as we heard 22 years ago, which is actually now 23 years ago, something happened that started me down a course in my life that completely changed everything for me. And what happened is I had an extraordinary moment of insight. One of those sudden things that you stop, doesn't matter what you're doing, and you suddenly see it differently from the way you were looking at it just a few minutes before. And my moment of insight was a profound one because it was about human differences. It was about the way that we are in the world. And what I suddenly got, what I grasped more than got, was how it is that we are actually different from each other. And for me, more importantly, what those differences are for, what we can use them for. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I was forever being told to use my head, to think before I spoke. It seemed to be a very common theme, and yet it doesn't matter how much I tried to ask people what they meant by that, or how exactly I was supposed to do it. No one really could give me a good answer. In fact, I concluded by the end of my education that no one really knew. And so it was that I spent a lot of my life, early part of my life, thinking about how I am different. I grew up in Europe, having been born in America. I lived in Switzerland. I went to school in England. This is confusing to a young boy of 8 years old. Lots of differences, lots of not belongings. So by the time I was in my mid-20s, I was doing what many people do, which is start reading books. If you will, it's when I suddenly understood that education might actually be valuable. And the kind of books I started to read were books on psychology. In fact, I started on philosophy. And those books on philosophy were extremely interesting because they would help me to understand one very simple, basic thing. What's going on inside here? And as I read the books on philosophy, there was this openness to the understanding of who we are as people. There seemed to be some almost prescient understanding of the way that life is and what it feels like, and who we are and what we're supposed to do. And the more I read those ancient philosophers, the more I realized that this was really quite exciting. And I moved on from philosophy and started reading about psychology. And it didn't take me very long when I started to read about psychology to realize that in our Western world, we're essentially taught to understand ourselves and everything in the world around us by how it's different from other things. We build a world, the scientific Western cultural world, based on the differences between things. We scrutinize them very, very carefully. We ascertain, literally, from the point of view of an observer, we look at the behaviors of things. And in looking at the behaviors of things, we try very hard to discern and to measure them very accurately so that we can say that this is something which is real. Now, in the world of psychology, how many of you here actually have done courses in or are in a course of psychology? Would you put your hands up? So quite a lot of you. Okay, so this is probably going to make sense to you because in this world of psychology, and specifically in the science of individual differences, which is the science of personality studies, there's a very basic approach which has been used now for a very long time. And I learned that it grew out of this Western philosophical tradition, which was very big and was not empirical in any way or sense of the word. And the new school of psychology, this was not very long ago, just over 100 years ago, the new school of psychology, and funny, the two first people who called themselves psychologists, one was a Dutch person from Groningen and the other one was a German, I think from Leipzig. And what they essentially were doing was to try to take this thing called philosophy and move it into the scientific empirical domain. This was after the Scottish Enlightenment period. Now, I'm not going to give you a lot of history, by the way, but I was fascinated by this. Because it occurred to me that suddenly people who were doing so well when they were simply philosophizing and teaching us how to spend a life more engaged, happier, more at ease with ourselves, all of a sudden these wonderful wisdoms of ancient philosophers that still haven't died, of course, the wisdom is still as pertinent today as it ever was, but all of a sudden we wanted to make psychology scientific. And of course the scientific method is all about empiricism, about the measurement of things. And so that's exactly what psychologists, the newly coined psychologists, started to do. They started to observe people and their behaviors most specifically. Which is fine, because what you do, you observe these behaviors and you put them down into little categories and you start to say to yourself, well, I'm going to call that one extroversion or introversion. Well, that guy sounds really agreeable, but I know lots of agreeable people, so I'm going to create a category called agreeable. Now, I'm being a little bit simplistic here, of course. But my point is that there is no sound basis, there is no theoretical basis for the terms that are used in describing people's individual differences. Not at all. Because there's no theory to them either. They're simply observations of who we are. And of course, every time we make an observation, and we want to use that observation in some way to understand something about someone, and how they're different from the person standing next to them, we get tied up into the differences between things. And they take us down a terrible road if we think about it. Because those differences, whilst there are just a few of them, you can kind of articulate them, you can see them, and maybe you can describe them. But as you add more differences to that, because of course when science gets a hold of something, it's just going to keep looking and keep looking and keep looking, and it will tear it apart and tear it apart, and we will go all the way down past atoms and neurons, all the way down to the subatomic particles, and so it grows and it grows, and all of a sudden we find that we start with more confusion, we end with more confusion than we started with. Because how do you make up a human being of all of these differences? Can you really look at the parts of a bicycle and describe what it is to ride it? I don't think so. So can we really understand human beings any better by understanding a litany of differences? And there are over 900 traits of individual difference that are statistically normed. That's a lot of information to try and carry in your head if you're trying to understand the differences between people. So this approach clearly has a problem. And I would put it to you that the biggest problem is not just the fact that we can't remember all of these different differences, because they're actually quite unrelated to each other. Agreeableness does not have anything that, other than perhaps a correlation, but no meaningful connection with neuroticism. And yet they're both traits of individual difference. So I would put it to you that without some overarching theory, without some unifying concept or framework within which we can understand ourselves, going down this path of looking at individual differences is going to continue to have us become more divided, more separate, more alone in our thoughts, and more distinct, more scrutinized. And I don't think that's a good idea. Because I think that we belong more than anything, and we seek belonging more than anything. And so I think when we start to approach the description of anything, especially for me, human beings, we have to do so from the point of view of what is it that makes us unified and whole, not what is it that makes us different. So in the trait-based world of psychology, and specifically individual differences in personality tests, the world seemed to, in the last few years, I don't know if you've noticed, but settled on what are called the Big Five, this five-factor model. These have been studied by some very notable scientists in the field, Costa and McRae, and a lot of work has been done. And these are said to be stable, and they're said to be relatively predictive. But at the end of the day, do you really think that you can describe a human being by those five traits and understand them and what they're doing, what they want, what they need, what moves them, what irritates them, what frustrates them, what stresses them? I don't think we can. I really don't think we can. So I learned a long time ago that if you really want to understand something, you have two options, not just one. The one option, of course, is the one that has been taken by the scientific approach to personality, which is to measure it empirically. But there is a more sound approach, I put it to you, in anything, which is to actually try to understand its operating system. That is, how it works at a most fundamental level. Because if we do that, we start with unity, one operating system, and we can understand how it operates, and how it creates differences, and why it creates differences, and what those are for. So the answer is, at the end of the day, if we want to open up the human mind, we have to actually find a different way of doing that. We cannot do it from this empirical Western approach. It doesn't work. If I was to say to you that you think like a fish, you would probably be a little bit offended. But it's exactly what I'm going to do. Because this insight I had 23 years ago, this remarkable insight, was so profoundly simple, it was so stunningly obvious, that as I tell you more about it during the next 45 minutes, I think the penny might also fall for you, which is, why did we not know this before? How could we not have known this? Because over the last 23 years, we have done a lot of scientific research, and we've involved, as Lou said, a lot of different practitioners of different kinds and experts in different fields around the world in this collaboration. And it seems that everyone starts off in the project, at least the scientists start off in the project, with a certain amount of skepticism. And a year to 2 years later, all of a sudden, it's their new best friend. They go, they do their work, they find out, they come back, and they say, yes, there's something extraordinary going on. So let me share a little bit of what I know. So why do we think like a fish? Well, these extraordinary creatures have been observed for centuries, of course millennia, by human beings, and those people have observed these things swimming in schools with remarkable precision. There's a ballet constantly flowing as these things move. There's always been a great debate as to how exactly do they know when to turn left or when to turn right, or when to go up or when to go down. And so there's been all kinds of theories. There's been theories of telepathy, there's been theories of electromagnetic signals, there's been theories of light pulses, chemistry, all sorts of extraordinary theories. Well, it turns out actually it's much simpler than anyone had thought, as it usually is. These fish have three simple rules. The first rule is this: if it looks like you, swim next to it. This is the rule of normalization. And if you think about it, it's incredibly obvious. From the minute one of these little fishes was born, what it sees around it, what it senses, what it smells, what it tastes in the water, is a certain state of normal. And if it continues, it becomes more normal. If this little fish is next to it with three yellow stripes, it doesn't know they're fish. It doesn't know to call them three yellow stripes. But it just keeps things that look like that around it. That's normal. If this is the distance, it keeps that distance. That's normal. In other words, the rule of normalization is this most fundamental thing that keeps us safe by sticking next to everything that is already okay and alive. It's normal. If I can see it, if I'm reacting to it, I'm alive, I must be okay, and therefore, I should keep following it. The rule of normal. The second rule that these fish are following is equally obvious. Maslow described it at the bottom of his hierarchy of needs. If it looks like you can benefit from it, If you can feed on it, if you can fight it for gain, or if you can fornicate with it, you go for it. This is the normal thing that we do as species, as people moving towards opportunity. The third rule that the fish use is equally obvious. If it looks like it's going to eat you, you go in the opposite direction. It's pretty simple. So keep swimming around the little yellow stripy things, keep it normal. If it looks like you can have some food, steer in that direction. Of course, everyone else is going to keep it normal with you. But if it looks like it's going to eat you, just simply turn around and go in the opposite direction. That's how fish and swallows and all of these other creatures that move in these large numbers and do so with such extraordinary precision and grace, that's how they're doing it. Now, I said you think like fish, and I meant it, because these three basic systems of thinking, moving towards things, moving away from things, and moving to keep things normal, it's a movement. It's not just a rest state, it's a movement. These three things are actually the most extraordinary biological subsystems, and every single person in this room and everywhere else on the earth is doing it all the time. But you see, we've become really, really sophisticated about how we do this. So let me show you the rules now as they apply to human beings. Let's start with the rule of normal. Well, the rule of normal is really about keeping everything just as it is. Not allowing things to break down. Not allowing things to become unstable. Keeping everything going on track. For us humans, we plan, we schedule, we organize. We think about ways of controlling things. We look to rules and regulations. We create societal norms. But all of these very, very sophisticated ways of actually keeping normal are simply the same rule enacted at higher and higher levels of intellectual consciousness. In the same way, when we look towards the future, we see possibilities and opportunities. So the second rule for fish, which is to move towards things, is there present in us because we have vision. We have ideas, we see how things can be. We imagine an unfolding as it goes forward in time. We stay open to possibilities as we move into the future. We look for these opportunities and pursue them. And as they change, we change direction very quickly. And that third rule that the fish is following as well, which is that if it looks like it's going to eat you, you run in the opposite direction. For us as human beings, that simply means that we try to avoid risk actively. We don't wait to see the danger. We anticipate the danger. We use experience because all of us have memory. All of us have these shared experiences. And we look to those shared experiences and we look to this memory to create certainty, understanding, insight, and of course all of the other things that as we become more sophisticated we can do, which is to measure things, to have precision and accuracy, and of course science, evidence, proof. So these three basic fundamental biological subsystems that operate in all living things, in us human beings, are operating all of the time at a higher level of sophistication. Now here's the difference between the fish and all of us. For the fish, these three things are rules. They have no self-consciousness. They have not got the ability to reflect, as far as we know. They cannot modify those rules in any way. They cannot overcome them. There's a stimulus and there's a response. There is food, there's a go for it. There's danger, there's a run for it. There's a no danger, no food, keep it normal. But in human beings we have choice. We can intercede or we can interfere in our processes. I can be about to do something and I can realize it's not a good idea and I can stop myself. I have that power to reflect. So for us human beings, we have the ability to intercede in the actions, and therefore we don't call them rules, we call them priorities. And those priorities are still there, they still drive us, they're still incredibly important. And if we let down our guard, they are simply what takes over. But most of us walk around pretty conscious. And so we're conscious of whether the priority that we're engaged with is or is not appropriate. Now, I'd like you to look at these three lists of words and think for yourselves, and we'll start at the first level, because, by the way, we all mix past, present, and future. We all mix these three dimensions of time in our thinking. We all mix these three sets of priorities. But look at these words for yourselves and ask yourself, which of these, at the most crass or gross level, in the most cumbersome way, is the one that you fit into? Because I know you fit into all of them to some degree. You might have two of them that you see as both being equally strong in you. You might have one that's strong and two not so much. You might see yourself in all three. But see if you can just start out with seeing yourself in one of these. So I'll give you a second to read through those lists, and I'm going to ask you which one you see yourself in. Now, because everybody in this room is actually expressed up here, then I expect everybody's hand to be able to go up at some point. All right? Okay, so how many of you feel that the words in this list called future are the words that most describe your true behavior when you're free to be yourself? Would you put your hands up for us? Well, 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 interesting. Okay, thank you. And how many of you have this center list of words as the one that you feel most expresses you when you're free to be yourself? Put your hands up. Okay. And then how many of you feel that the list of past words with science and academic, and put your hands way up so we can see them. Okay. Well, I would say that that's about a third, which is really interesting. Really interesting. Good. Well, we'll come back to this a little bit more. So now, as I said, all of us combine all three of these. It's impossible not to have one of these. You simply would not be able to conceptually exist. You would stop being you. You would disappear, kind of thing. Whilst we have some of all three, we create what we call archetypes. So if you imagine the blending of these three and how many different combinations there actually are, there are 10. And those 10 archetypes serve as a very simple shorthand to be able to actually say, this is the way this person is thinking. And what's very interesting about this is it does not actually describe behavior in the way that a trait-based personality model does at all. What it really is describing is what you're trying to move towards in your thoughts. It's long been said that thoughts are movement, and movement is thought. These are two things that you almost cannot separate as two concepts. The instant you start thinking, you are in some form of movement. So when you look at this map of these three fundamental constructs of certainty, probability, and possibility, past, present, and future, when you see those three constructs, everything that's happening inside that map is about movement. And therefore, all thought is expressed within that map. Everything we do begins with a thought. So we can say that everything we do actually begins as a kind of motion that is expressed in this map. So if you find yourself being one of the people who said, past thinking, that's the one that resonates, then you are constantly moving towards the concepts like certainty, validation, information, facts, research, detail, truth, trust. And I don't mean just on the superficial level of academia or work life. I mean at the most fundamental level. If past thinking was the one that you put your hand up, I know, I can predict, and you don't have to say yes or no, but I can predict that the most important thing for you in a relationship with another person is that you can trust them. And I also know that if that trust is broken, it will never, ever, ever be regained for you. I also know it takes a lot of time in history with someone to develop that trust. It's not spontaneous. I also know as past thinking, not you as individuals, but as past thinking, there's a skepticism that you have, which in later life can sometimes become a cynicism about people. I also know that having the truth is the most important thing that you can have. And when asked a question, if you cannot give an answer which is truthful, it becomes very difficult indeed. It becomes very stressful. I know when you don't think you have the answer to a piece of information, for example, when you were studying in class, and you were asked to actually answer a question, you didn't have it, that felt really, really, really bad. Well, how do I know that? I know that because past thinking, this risk aversion, is something we can fundamentally understand, because it's not a trait. It's a fundamental need of human beings, and I have it too, even if it's not the most dominant thing in my set of thinking tools. Those of you who use present thinking predominantly, and who put your hands up, I know for you that keeping order is really important. Now, I know that sometimes can sound as though it's a jokey thing, but actually when there's disorder, when there's chaos, when things are not going according to your plan, there is a great deal of internal instability. There's a lot of stress that happens. And if that state is maintained over time, if you find that you cannot control your environment, or your schedule, or your rhythm, that you cannot plan, if that happens over time, you find yourself getting into a very deep level of stress. For you, the idea is to try to achieve harmony. And I don't mean in some touchy-feely sense of the word harmony. I mean really be in harmony with people and your environment and what you're doing all of the time. And what you're tracking for the most part, I think, is probably what goes out of harmony, what becomes imbalanced. And what you try to do is to create stability again. And I know that you do this through looking and watching at relationships and how things are relative to other things and tracking them over time. You follow trends. You look at fashion. And I don't just mean clothes fashion. I mean all fashion, all things that come into the set of norm. I know that that present thinking is an extremely deep drive in all people who use it predominantly to be normal, to fit in, to know where you belong, to have a place. It always says it somewhere, doesn't it? Little confirmations, I love them in the world. At least I take them as confirmations. It's my happy story. And those of you who are past thinking, and by the way, I personally use a lot of past thinking. And that past thinking is that kind of thinking that has you constantly looking for the new to change. Sorry, future. Yes, my apologies. Luckily, someone's awake right here. That future constantly has you looking for new opportunities and how things can change and what you can do. It's almost as though you cannot help yourself. And I know the experience. You're driving down the road and you see that there's an empty shop. And many people, you think, would just drive past and then look, there's an empty shop. Or they wouldn't notice it at all. But the future thinking in us, and those of you who have future thinking, probably notice that shop, and in your imagination you see an opportunity. You can't help it. There's nothing you can do about it. Because wherever you are, whatever you're doing, your particular radar is attuned to the opportunities in the environment. Just as the radar of present thinking is attuned to what is normal in the environment, and past thinking is attuned to what are the risks in the environment. Again, we all have some of all three blended in our thinking. And yes, to answer the question that's got to be on someone's mind, it doesn't change significantly from what we can understand during your lifetime. Yes, we do adapt to a certain degree. Absolutely. Neuroplasticity is a well-known phenomenon. But do we change the fundamental operating system? Do we change the way that we are operating at that level? No, I do not believe we do. And of course, it's going to be a few generations before we can confirm that. And certainly I won't be around. But so far, after 22, 23 years, the evidence seems to be that this is pretty stable and very predictable. I talk about evidence, so I feel just for a second I have to actually share with you what kind of evidence I'm talking about. I'm a future thinker, and as a future thinker, I'm always coming up with new ideas. I'm always having vision. That's my drive. I'm always moving towards the future. And I'm very conscious, certainly in an academic environment, that there's a lot of past and present thinking. And so I'm conscious to bring this evidence to the foreground because I'm not a scientist. I'm an enthusiast. But I'm not a scientist. But I work with scientists, and I've learned their language. In fact, since I had this insight, one of the things that I have learned is how difficult it is to actually engage with people who are extremely different from you. In working on this particular part of the project with scientists, In fact, I believe one spoke here at the Ruch last year, Dan Ariely. And back then he was at MIT at the Sloan School. And now he's, I think, at Brown University. So Dan was one of those scientists. And Dr. Vince Fortunato, more recently, in the last now 12 years, has been our chief scientist. So in doing this work, I realized that I had to go out to these scientists and find something out. I had to have something more real, more concrete than me waving my arms around saying I have an idea. Because that wasn't going to be taken seriously. So in turning to people like Vince, I learned how to deal with past thinking. Now that sounds like a bit of a negative way of putting it. But from my very future thinking point of view, having to engage with people who have these, now I regard them as very beautiful minds to scrutinize the details, that do not move past go unless they actually have the proof that's the right way to go, that take the time to do the analysis, to measure, to weigh the pros and cons, to judiciously study the data, not to look into it and find what they want to see, but to look what is really there, the truth. But what we managed to do during that period of time is to look at the 30 top personality or individual differences traits that are used, including the Big Five and many others. And Vince did this work, and remarkably, it showed that all of these trait-based models, the ones such as the Big Five, fit perfectly well with the theory of mind time, which basically says there are 3 operating mechanisms, constructs, that create all of these differences. So as you'd expect, if you look to the science of individual differences, the science that is done should agree with the science that we did, and of course it finally did. And what it led us to understand was not just that introversion and neuroticism and agreeableness and openness and conscientiousness and all of these others actually could be understood within the framework, but we actually gave rise to the answer of what is that individual difference for? What does it actually do? And that's a remarkable thing, because up until that point in time, all we could talk about were that these individual differences existed and could be identified and measured with some form of measure, typically a paper and pencil test or an online version. And the science that Vince did actually showed that these individual differences, as you would expect, fit into the framework where you would expect them to fit, which is a remarkable thing. And so in dealing with those scientists, for all of those years, I learned how to have an incredibly deep respect for past thinking. Now, that does not mean that I can actually use my past thinking any better, and that's the strange thing. I understand, I'm open to it, I understand the value of it, I understand in an intellectual way the process, the methodology, and how we're going at it. But I cannot for the life of me convince myself to think that way. Not because it's not fantastic, but because I'm not wired that way. And no amount of hard work on my part, no amount of years of working with Vince has actually changed that wiring. I promise you, ask Vince. I'm just as difficult to deal with today as a future thinker as I ever was. So what this essentially told us is that unlike the realm of personality, which is this outward side observing, or rather the outward person, the outside person, observing the behavior, what we actually got to is a beginning of an understanding of what is actually going on inside the black box. And in many ways this changed everything for us. Because we know that there cannot be a behavior without a context. There cannot be a behavior without some situation happening. In other words, a behavior is an interaction between something and something else. It cannot happen in isolation. There is no behavior. But what we learned now is that we have a language of movement. We have a language of how people move in their thinking that is not context dependent. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what's happening to you. You will always, always drive with the priorities as you have them in that particular blend. So if you're a past thinking person, if you're a person who predominantly uses past thinking, it doesn't matter if you're on holiday. It doesn't matter if you're reading a newspaper, if you're talking with a friend. That is the way that you are operating. You are looking to the detail. You are looking to the information. You are looking to understand and find meaning. And if you're a person who uses present thinking, you are always looking for what is my relationship and what is their relationship with the other people around them. In other words, where does this person fit in the schema of things and where do I fit relative to them? And if you're a future thinker or a person who uses future thinking, then you're always looking towards what is the opportunity here. And it's remarkable how quickly future thinkers get bored. Isn't that true? So, another thing that I want to point towards is, if this model is real, then it must actually be seen or be able to be used in lots of different ways. In other words, I'm talking about a theory here. And if it's a theory that is true, and we say that all human beings fit in here and all of these differences can be understood within it, then it should be true in lots of different places. And the first thing that we looked at is the scalability, what we call the fractal nature of it. Now, this was a fascinating thing, because the same language with which you describe an individual, a blend of past, present, and future thinking, you can actually describe the dynamics within a team, past, present, and future thinking. You can describe the dynamics in the entire organization as a culture by simply understanding past, present, and future thinking. You can do it for a culture of a country. In fact, that slide on the right-hand side, the map that you see, is not an organization. It actually happens to be a population test of the population of France, a cross-section. Very past thinking. So what we have is a model that is remarkable because you can use it at lots of different scales of aggregation. You can understand yourself and another person. You can put a group of people together and you can start to understand them as a group and their dynamics, or you can look at very large populations, which is really, really lucky, because what we love to do is to understand how and why we are doing what we're doing as cultures and populations. And I want to tell you about a project we're running here in the north of Holland in a little bit. But it's wonderful because it means that we can speak, we can be in front of individuals and talk to them as we are this evening, sharing this model, and it's very useful to you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about learning and education in a second. Or we can turn it and look at an entire city, community, or a province like the north of Holland, and we can learn really, really important things about what we need and what we're doing and how we're doing it. All right. As I said, if a model is real, rather if a framework or theory is real, it should be able to be seen in lots of existing frameworks. Now, I just want to take you down a couple of them. How many of you heard of The Chasm? The Chasm is a book that was written by Geoffrey Moore. It's a fascinating book because it was all about how ideas, and in his case he wrote it specifically about technology and marketplaces, but really it's a thesis of how ideas enter marketplaces, which is a different way of saying how ideas enter human minds. And so I want to share it with you because when I showed this to some folks in London, the hair almost caught on fire. There was a large marketing company. Because suddenly they had seen something about the MindTime model that they'd never seen before in terms of human understanding. And this is what it is. So when we look at this chasm, we see that the chasm happens after these enthusiasts on the left-hand side have adopted a product very early. So how many of you in here would consider yourselves to be enthusiasts? And put your hands up, the early adopters, the future thinkers, the ones from before? Yeah, okay, you. All right. So these are these enthusiasts who go and run out and get a product as soon as it comes out. And then, of course, sales slow down, or the thing slows down, and all of a sudden it hits this chasm. And the big thing in the world is to try to get your idea across the chasm. And by the way, it doesn't matter if it's a political idea, it doesn't matter if it's a marketing idea. The idea is get the idea across the chasm and it will be adopted. So what happens is the idea comes into the marketplace, and it struggles in, and it gets there, and it gets this early enthusiasm from the early adopters, and it runs up the hill, and it's all puffing full of steam, and whoops, it suddenly gets to that chasm. And if you can figure out how to get it across that chasm, then you're home. Because up you go, and you get all of these early majority adopters. This is the largest segment of the population, and if you get those, then the laggards, the skeptics, the past thinkers, engage. All right? So this is a very acknowledged framework of understanding or thinking in the world of business. What we did is took a little idea of Einstein's which says to put two things together and make them have any sense, you have to find an inertial frame of reference, something outside of the two things to look at them. And in our case, time is a very foundational part of the entire MindTime model. So when we look at time and we look at the chasm, we realize that the chasm's line of time is going in exactly the opposite direction. So we pulled a little trick with some graphics and we simply turned the chasm around. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. So having turned the chasm around, we can now actually take our little triangle and put it on top of the chasm by turning the chasm upside down. Now, if you were Geoffrey Moore, you'd probably be having an awful lot of problems with this, because I literally had taken your model, swung it around, and turned it upside down and shoved mine on top of it. Not very nice, sorry, Geoffrey. But I think it'll make the point when I do this. You see, because what we found out was that every single label that Geoffrey Moore had put on his model was exactly the same label that we put on our model. Wow. This basically means that this well-known way of understanding marketplaces and human beings is the same well-known way of understanding human beings and differences that we've been doing for 23 years. And sure enough, when we get our idea back in here, we suddenly understand what's going on. As an idea enters the marketplace, it meets these early adopters, you future thinkers. Can you see yourself in here? You future thinkers, is this you? You adopt products early? Nodding head, wagging head, a little bit of wagging head? Yeah, okay. And then, those of you who have present thinking, don't you wait to see until some of your kind of more racy, futury kind of friends have adopted it. And when they've got it and they've had it a little while and they say they like it and it's useful and it fits in their life and you can see that it does fit in their life and they really are using it, it's not just another gadget, you're laughing, aren't you? Yeah. Because at that point in time, you kind of go like, oh, okay, this looks useful, I could use that, I get how it works, it'll fit in my life. Well, in fact, it'd be quite a lot of help. And now you go and you buy one, don't you? And we move further across into the mind of humanity. Now, how many of you were past thinking predominantly? Did you put your hands up again? Okay, you still haven't bought this at all, have you? Because you're going to get there in your own time. And it's only when everyone's got one, everyone's bought into the idea, and you've stopped going like, yeah, give it some time. Yeah, give it some time. Truth comes out. Yeah. And you're right. Because the one thing that we cannot afford to do is to have a society suddenly jump just because that lot and that lot said it's a good idea. Because neither of them need certainty before they move. One moves because of a possibility or an opportunity, and the other one moves simply because it fits a plan. It doesn't say it was the right plan, and it doesn't say it was the right opportunity. Do you see how this works? Because we as a system, as a society, as a thinking system, are actually doing something remarkably clever. And when I said that you thought like fish, I really meant it, because collectively together we're doing something that we could not imagine. And the reason we can't imagine it is because we're obsessed with our differences. We're continuously thinking that we are whole and individual and discrete and nothing to do with anybody else. And yet what I'm showing you is that as we go across here, that not only did the future thinking part of you, but the future thinkers, part of community, society, culture, your organization, your family, were part of this journey individually, and you were part of this journey individually as well. But whilst you were part of a journey individually, you were not a party of an individual journey. You were a part of a collective journey individually. Do you see the difference between those 2 points? And this is really important. Because at any given moment in time, it's your turn to think in society. At any given moment in time, we need you to do your bit, whether it's to push for something new or whether it's to hold back from the new because we simply don't know enough yet. Or whether it's to steer and continue steering as we're doing and disregard both the new and what was told before. We are all a part of one system of thinking. And then we think about the world this way. We start to understand that what we think of as being individualism is actually collectivism with an individual experience. And that's great. Okay, so off the end of there we go, and we realize that there's an extraordinary number of implications in this entire thing. And I'm not going to read them all to you, it's obvious, but the very first one is learning, so I want to talk about that. Now, one thing they taught me in doing presentations is never put too much text on the slide, all right? Now, remember, I'm a future thinker, I don't learn very much from past thinkers, so actually I put lots of text on my slide, but it's not really for you, it's for me. Because this way I can look at my screen and I can remember some of the things, because there are 10 different archetypes. And even when I reduce it to 7, there's too much information for me to hold all of the time. But you past thinkers, I do understand that your learning is about being quiet, being alone, allowing to dive in and understand and find meaning on your own. I do understand that you only need a certain amount of structure, and you certainly don't need chaos. And I do understand that you need authority. You need people who you can trust are telling you the truth, the best information possible. You need sources that you can rely on. And those of you who use present thinking, I know that you need a plan. You need milestones, you need goals. You need to organize your time and schedule it, and you need to do it in plenty of time. You need to do your studies in plenty of time. You need to have your work completed to hand in plenty of time. All of these things are really, really important. And you future thinkers, I know that you need to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's the 8 o'clock exam. That's when you started studying. Oh, yeah. So how can we use this information? How can we use this information really powerfully? So I know the majority of here in the audience are students, so I really want to focus in on what this means in terms of learning. Because for me, if you can simply understand that your thoughts are in motion, and in order to learn anything, you need to understand what is the motion of your thought, and where do you find that in the thing that you're trying to learn. Let me give you a very brief example. If you are a present thinker, your thoughts, your needs are moving towards acquiring the ability to implement the skills that are given to you through this knowledge. You want to know how to put it to use. You want to know how to actually effect change. You want to know what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and how to measure when it's done. You want to implement it. That's why you're there. That's why you're here. Because you love information not for knowledge's sake for knowledge, but you love knowledge for the sake of what it will allow you to do to change things more effectively. And those of you who use past thinking, I know that you are here, you are studying because you really deeply need to know. You need to know because it's the only way that you can avoid mistakes. It's the way to avoid being wrong. And being wrong is not okay for past thinking. Because being wrong is akin to falling off the edge of something and having made the wrong choices, the wrong decisions, taking enormous risks. Wrong in a calculation, that's a calculation that, I don't know, keeps an aircraft in the air. Life or death decision on the surgery table. So there's no wrong, which is okay. So those of you with past thinking are really, really, really focused on acquiring this information accurately and authoritatively from people that you can trust. Just as the future thinkers, you're studying, and the information may be interesting. Don't get me wrong. It's not that it's not interesting to you, but your driving motivation is that this information will open and yield opportunity. It will yield opportunity for you. You're interested not only in the information, but in the qualification. And what you can then do with that out there in the real world. So that's one thing that I can tell you about thinking and learning. Here's another thing. Collaborative thinking. Okay? We are always learning. And the best learning happens when you diversify the thinking in your learning groups. Now I want to give you a very brief little example. There are 4 maps up here. I'm sure you can interpret them pretty well by now. There's the 3 constructs, there's dots in the middle of the map. Where the dot is based upon the relative degree of attraction to the construct. So if it's nearest past thinking is the strongest thinking. If it's in the middle, all 3 are equal. If it's future thinking, then it's future thinking. Now what I want you to notice is that map A has all 4 dots, relatively speaking, in the future area. These are 4 students who would get on really, really famously together. They'd be totally digging it. They'd be in a groove. They would be finishing each other's sentences, but they wouldn't be doing their schoolwork. Not ever. If you look at the group in map B, you see 4 people in 4 different areas. They're not too far apart. So I'm going to guess that this would be a pretty good collaborative learning group. You're going to have to understand each other's differences. You'd have to learn how to tolerate differences, you'd have to learn how to value them, and then you'd have to learn how to respect them. But if you formed a group like that with your cohorts, then you're going to do some really good learning, because you can help each other. If you're in map C, okay, it looks like you have a good distribution, but you've got a tiny problem here. The one down there in the future thinking, that's me. And the problem is that that person probably won't show up on time, or at all. And the problem is that the other three are pretty much aligned. They're past and present thinking. They kind of have this train going. We've got a plan. Let's stick to the plan. We're going to read the book. Let's read the book. Well, it was part of the plan, so I'm going to read the book. Now, the past person read the book because it was a damn good book to read, full of really good knowledge. The present person read the book because it was on the plan. The future person didn't read the book because they didn't read the plan and they didn't get the book from the bookshop. This is just how we are. Okay. Group D is going to be a really, really successful academic group. But none of the bars in town are going to make a cent from them, because they'll always be studying, they'll always have a plan, and they are always going to be very, very studious as a group of people. Now, I'm joking about the bar. But this is a group that actually would be qualified, or rather would qualify, would do very well academically, but it would find a lot of challenge in applying that information out in the real world where things do not stay stable, where you actually have to deal with change, and you have to deal with problems that you didn't foresee, where plan A, B, C, and D no longer actually cut it. It's the kind of world that we're waking up and living in today, a world full of paradox, a world full of change that we cannot predict. So learning isn't just about learning a subject, learning is how to learn. And part of the learning you can do here is learning how to learn with the right people and how to adapt and how to bring the right people around you, because I didn't just say that this was good for learning at university or in educational systems. I said this is good for learning. And our organization, our foundation, does this every day. We look at who we are, what our thinking styles are, how we're using them, who we're asking to do what and why. We also look at the phases that we're working through. Is it time for more future thinking and brainstorming, or is it time to actually do some validation of those brainstorming sessions? Or is it actually time to put things into action, to develop a plan and to stick to it? And how do you stop the future thinking from upsetting the plan or getting in the way of the validation? And it's the discipline around that. And it does take discipline. But the benefits of developing that discipline, the benefits of actually understanding the value that you bring as individuals, and understanding that you are not on your own journey, you are on a journey with other people, and you are a part of it collectively. Whether it be an obvious team of people, or whether it be a part of a community or a society. That everybody has value to bring, and everyone is constantly bringing that value. Including, and you have to understand when you're on a team that you have these two different points of view. You have the person you're looking at that you think you know, and there's your mind, which is doing the knowing. Thus, you are getting in the way of the picture. So one of the most powerful things you can do in learning is to understand the difference between what is and what you see being. In other words, you have to understand your own thinking to see how it's getting in the way of understanding what is really happening outside of yourself. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. So Santa Clara University, USA, Silicon Valley. This is a university that does MBA programs, and it does a lot of them. And it puts people through there, well, let's just say as quickly as they can. All right? Quite expensive and very successful. We asked these students who are MBA students, as I mentioned, we asked them to answer some questions for us. Now, I'm not going to give you all of them, but I want to show you a couple. One of the questions we asked them was, my experience here was enjoyable, that I actually enjoyed it. And if you look at, we have these 10 archetypes of thinking style down the left-hand side. And you can clearly see that the thinking style that did not enjoy it, I hope you can clearly see it, is the very top one, past thinking. I don't know if you can read that. But past thinking, and any part of past thinking said, no, I'm not actually enjoying the experience as much as everybody else is. But the future and present thinkers seem to have a really good time, which is really wonderful. Then we asked them the ultimate question. Was it worth the money? And we found that the same thinking style was saying no. In fact, it was saying no even more strongly than we simply asked them if they enjoyed their experience. So just to frame this, so imagine those past thinkers in the audience here. Imagine you're at a university doing a Master's of Business Administration, And you go like, no, I'm not enjoying this. Now, why would you do that? You are studying, you're in an academic environment, and somehow, in this particular survey that we did at Santa Clara, those very people are saying, no, I didn't enjoy it. This is remarkable. So we wanted to look and say, well, is there something else going on here? So we looked at a whole bunch of different demographics, and we looked at gender, and we looked at age, and we looked at other things, and in all cases we found that those were not responsible for the reason why people said they weren't enjoying it and they didn't think it was worth the money. In other words, it really was their thinking style that was behind these opinions. So there's something afoot here. And so we thought about it a lot, and we realized that this university was not only in Silicon Valley, but it was catering to entrepreneurs and to people who wanted to go and start up startups, or people who wanted to go and work for venture capital funds. In other words, these were very future-thinking, opportunity-oriented people. And sure enough, when we look at the question, I learn by traditional teaching methods best, we see that the past thinkers agree. In other words, we tested our own data and we found out that indeed, yes, the past thinkers were the past thinkers we thought we were measuring, the ones like traditional educational systems. So we decided to investigate a little bit further. It wasn't enough to understand that this was in Silicon Valley, a very future-oriented city in a very future-oriented state in America, which itself is a very future-oriented culture. We know we've done all of these measurements. So in other words, this is the tippy-top of future, and the past thinkers aren't liking it. Well, that's one good reason, but what else? Well, these are the people in that crowd that I showed you, the MBA students, who said no, they didn't like it, didn't enjoy it, and didn't think it was worth the money. And that is their professor. I think I made my point. Just a little while ago, we launched a survey here in Groningen, in fact, the north of Holland. And we're very interested in learning some things about the population. We're working in collaboration with the digital officer for the gemeente and several different organizations. And we're trying to grow this because we want to prepare for a digital future that we don't know. In other words, we cannot predict what the future will be like. What we can do is understand ourselves and how we will react to any given future. And this is what that's about. So in this particular case, we asked the question as whether we thought that smartphones, or living without smartphones, would make people happy. And I put this in here just to give you an orientation before I show you the next slide, which will surprise you. The orientation is simply that yes is red, it's hot, I like it. Blue is no, I don't like it. Okay, it's dead simple, it's like Facebook. Yes, red, no blue, all right. Present thinkers really believe that we would all be a hell of a lot happier if we didn't use these smartphones. And I would also tell you that present thinkers are the most practical, hands-on, like to keep it real and like to be right here and now. The future and past thinkers are off communicating with people somewhere else in the universe, and they love the digital device. Okay, we get that. All right, so you see how it works. So the Dutch educational system does a good job preparing young people for the future. Now, we cannot draw any conclusions because n equals around 100. But these are very highly predictive maps. This is very special technology we've developed over the years, and we use it for surveys in exactly these sorts of instances, because we can use relatively small n numbers and start getting some very early insights into directionality. We're truly looking forward to seeing what this will say when n equals 10,000 or 50,000. That will be really interesting. In the meantime, what this is telling me is that the educators, the past, present thinkers, do indeed believe that a good job is being done. And they may absolutely be correct. I have no idea. But the future thinkers, the ones who don't do very well in school to start with, you got it, still not happy. In other words, you should all go to Silicon Valley. There's a school called Santa Clara, and you'll be really, really happy there, because the past thinkers hated it, okay? All right. And just sort of to wrap it up a little bit here, artificial intelligence, yes, this is a really big one, because in preparing for the future, I would say that as a person who travels the world, who's lived in Silicon Valley for a number of years, the single greatest, extraordinary, most mind-blowing thing that's ever happened to humanity is about to happen. It hasn't happened yet. And whether we like the idea or not, whether we think it's good for us or bad, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever, because we are about to enter a world of artificial intelligence. And the debate is going to be very big. And even if the debate is very big and very loud, it doesn't mean it isn't going to happen, and happen a lot, everywhere, to all of us. The question is, what do we feel about that? Are we ready for it? How are we going to approach it? How will it change our lives? Can we be ready for it? Well, when we asked the question of whether people feared it or not, we found that the past thinkers had the tendency to believe that indeed it does probably pose a threat. And the future thinkers are going, no, not at all. But then when we look at some of the voices behind those two, the past thinking and the future thinking, we can see that someone like an Elon Musk, who's an engineer, he's got visions of taking humanity to Mars and populating it. In fact, the whole car business, the whole battery business are just steps on the way because he had to build those technologies in order to do the next one. Remarkable. But he says, no, be careful. And Mark Zuckerberg, who woke up one day and had 10,000 people or 100,000 people on his little new site, said, it'll all be fine. And we could predict it because Mark Zuckerberg is probably a very strong future thinker. And Elon Musk is probably a past-present thinker, even though he's a visionary. So this to me is showing me that there's a very important conversation that we can begin to have that we have not been able to have before. Because up until now, we have not had the means to understand our individual differences in any way that could really make sense of this kind of information. And today we do. Today we have a model which is a theoretical model. It actually is a framework rather than a model. That we have enough science around, we have enough understanding of, that we believe we can actually start to put it to use in very, very significant ways. And one of the ways we've done that is in education, mapping entire universities. We do it in organizations by mapping organizations as thinking systems. And we also want to do it, as I mentioned, by mapping populations and understanding how are we going to deal with some of the things that are coming up. Migration, artificial intelligence, traffic, pollution, food. Because the one thing that we don't know at the moment is the truth about how we humans really will be able to react and cope, what we want. What we have is surveys of marketplaces and things which are, unfortunately, horribly flawed. Not flawed in the methodology, I'm sure the methodology is wonderful, but that there is no model, there's no framework, there's no theory to understand the human element in it. And therefore we don't really put ourselves in that picture. We're left out of it. And I don't think that's what we should be doing. I think we should take our role in the future very, very seriously. And the only way we can do that is when we understand ourselves as a collective of people who actually share different aspects of the same thing. And that together, uniformly, we can actually create a voice that can create meaningful change in the world. But we have to know where we're starting, which is with our own thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Very inspiring and really interesting. A little bit confrontational talk at times. I started thinking, yeah, I'm totally future thinking. And I'm like, no, maybe not so much. We have about 25 minutes maybe for questions. So I'd like to open up the floor. I'm sure there are some. Yes.
First I'd like to thank you for the talk. It was actually the first time I spent in a lecture and it passed like 10 minutes, so that's quite nice. I have a question regarding those three mindset, the past, present, and future. Like, for a general picture, what type of job careers or fields would you consider each one to fit most comfortably in?
That's a great question. So think of it, because you can do this exercise for yourselves. And the idea here is, as much as possible, if you can grasp this, you can answer all of these questions. So the way to think about that question is to say, what requires people to be certain, to need certainty? What values that? Engineers, doctors, scientists, mathematicians, accountants, lawyers, legal systems. You see? Just think, where does certainty belong in our world? Where does it show up? What does it want to do? We know it slows things down. Not in the sense of slow, but in the sense of whoa, we don't know enough yet. So you'll find these people be other people in meetings who will slow down and say, well, hang on a second. And you go like, well, there's always negative coming from these people. It's always negative. It's not. What it is the need to be certain before one takes action. So any profession which has that, any area of human endeavor that has that driving need to be certain before it takes action is a past thinking. Present thinking, you'll find it in every area that needs to actually create stable processes. Accountants, planners, city planners, people who plan space voyages, for that matter, have to have a lot of that present thinking. People who operate in the police force, people who operate in the gemeentes, people who administer universities and hospitals, nurses, military personnel. All of these people are trying to create stability. All of these people are using rules and regulations to actually create stability, whether it be in community, in society, or in an operating theatre itself. And future thinkers tend to be those who are looking for opportunity. So you see them being entrepreneurs, salespeople, politicians. You see them being the artists, or what we think of as the creators. And it's not to say that only future thinkers creative, don't get me wrong here. But they tend to be the ones who live a creative life. They're kind of bohemian amongst us. Yeah, you know who you are anyway. So I don't know if that answers your question, okay, but look for the movement. Look for the movement in that particular thought process, which is either towards openness and flexibility and openness of future thinking, or right, this certainty, the solidness of information of past thinking, or this procedure of present. And you'll always be able to answer those questions. Yeah. Run!
Yeah.
Throw it.
It's more time efficient.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, I'm a past thinker, and I had a question. Can we download your presentation somewhere to look it over again?
It would be my pleasure. Yeah. No, I totally get. Look, hold the second thought for 1 second. It simply is this strong and powerful. There is no way a past thinker could have listened to me standing here, a future thinker, for 1 hour and buy a single word that I said. Not going to happen. Past thinkers, am I right? Yeah. You need to go away and get there by yourselves. You need to build this. You either need to read, if you're interested at all, you'd want to read our papers. You'd want to see what research we've done. You'd want to read about what's this whole area of individual differences. Is this even possible? You will get there on your own time, because there is no room for error in a certain mind. You don't believe other people just because they look nice, or because they sound nice, or because they're paid a lot, or because they're standing in front of you. That's not why you believe them. You believe things. You don't believe people. You believe things because you have figured it out for yourselves, right? Second part of the question. Was there a second? That's good. Okay. All right.
Kirsten moved on to there was some lady in the back.
Thanks for your insights. I have a question about the slide looking at teams and how teams are effective that have people of the different sides. And I wonder if you can give us some advice on how to navigate the differences in such teams. To give an example, I tend to go to the past thinking, somewhat at the present. My boss is exactly like you, future or maybe even outside the triangle. How do we navigate?
There's a Dutch word I learned. Sorry.
How do we navigate our differences?
Awareness. You know, I think of awareness as being like the headlights on a car on a dark night. It's everything. When a group of people who are otherwise well-meaning, because it does require people to be well-meaning, but when a group of people who otherwise are well-meaning are engaged in a task collectively, together, collaboratively, where the outcome of the task is one that they all want, then you have to create an awareness of what might be getting in the way. Because reaching goals is all about removing the friction, removing the impediments, getting things out of the way. And the thing that will get in the way more often than not on anything that we do as human beings collectively is the human element. We just do that because we don't understand how to use our differences effectively most of the time. And I've worked around organizations for 25, 30 years. And very rarely are organizational problems of marketplaces in truth. They're the humans in the market, but of products or circumstances or money. Those aren't the problems. The problems are people. And our lack of awareness of our differences and how to use them together. And I think that we have been so short-handed in a language, a framework, a way of understanding our differences that was useful. I mean, there's some 900 individual differences, traits. You may know 300, I may know 300, but we still haven't got the same 300. It's not helping us. So awareness is the number one thing that's going to make the difference. And then the second thing is when people accept themselves for who they are and you actually understand and appreciate the value that they bring, then you change everything. We have a saying, it's a thought, it's a very important one for us in the foundation. It's been with us for 23 years in terms of a spirit of being, an ethos in our work. And we call it the golden thought. And it's very simply this: everyone has value to bring. Now, that sounds simplistic, but think about it for a second. If you really believe that, when you meet someone for the first time and you're shaking their hand and you're looking at that person, and you're asking yourself the question, what's the value that person brings? What you're not doing is thinking about yourself. And that's a big start. Yeah, truly. What you are now thinking about is to observe what's the value that person could bring. Do you know that the simple act, without a word being uttered, the simple act of really paying attention to someone else changes the human dynamic totally? Because we know that's happening. So awareness brings about an openness to understanding the differences. And understanding of the differences brings about a respect for the value of those differences. A respect for the value of those differences brings about collaboration and cooperation and trust and all of these other pieces. And it's as important to not only have the awareness and the understanding, but to manage our expectations. Because just because another person knows they're a future thinker does not mean they're going to change. Same with past and present thinking. But what we can do is understand how to use those particular value, that particular value rather, and those differences in really constructive ways. And I would say that the interaction between future and past thinking is one of the most difficult. Because the past always feels like it's going in diametrically the opposite direction, which is to slow things down from the future thinker's point of view, and the future thinker is always taking off and changing everything before you know anything. And there is a natural conflict in there, which is, by the way, the grist for the mill. In other words, the stuff you put in the flour so it grinds nice and fine to produce beautiful flour. It's necessary. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Someone, yeah, the first, yeah, in the back. Can you raise your hand? Yeah.
I've got a question about your remark on organizational culture. Actually, it's two very strongly related questions. You mentioned French population as an example of people who are predominantly past thinkers. And I'm curious to know how you would classify the Dutch population, and if you would find somewhere around the world, in Europe or elsewhere, an exceptional or astonishing classification that you didn't expect before.
Interesting question. Okay, so you said how would I describe the Dutch population was the first, right? And I would start out by saying, very carefully, seeing as I'm standing in Holland with a bunch of Dutch people in front of me. So let me start with that caveat. I believe that the Dutch population is a very interesting one. And in fact, I have had conversations about the Dutch population with a couple of... really interesting. What amazes me is the influence of circumstance and environment. Because when I arrived here, I realized that you all live underwater. No, I mean it really seriously. There is no assumed, there is no presumption of day-to-day safety such as you would have on the deserts of Nevada, for example. Well, you'd have a different danger there altogether, but it's a nuclear testing ground. But you have a circumstance in Holland that drives something really extraordinary, and what it drives is tolerance, because you need each other. Because every single person in Holland culturally knows that they cannot do it on their own, because when there's a leak, there's a big leak. And it's going to affect everybody. So you develop tolerance. So from the outside point of view, I would describe the Dutch culture as an integrated culture, balancing all three. And yet it has a remarkable capacity to deal with extremes of future, past, and present thinking as well. Not so Switzerland, which is a very present thinking culture, which has very little tolerance for future thinkers, as does France, by the way. So I find Holland a very interesting place from that point of view, because it allows to have this dynamic which shows up in different places, and yet overall it's very integrated, it's very calm, it's very accepting, and it gets stuff done. So there's the present thinking, there's the past thinking, and there's the future thinking in there. Where in Europe have I had something that's really surprised me? Gosh, that's a really hard one. I'm going to ponder, because I don't want to give you some flippant answer and really annoy somebody who's from that country. I've learned not to do that. It's one of the future thinking things I used to do. Then I got check mouth. No, okay. I'm going to have to think about the country one. But most countries have relatively distinct cultures from a thinking style point of view, MindTime point of view. And it's really remarkable once you know what it is, and you go there and you just see it. And you talk to the people there, and you talk to a person who's not of that thinking style, the predominant one, and they'll tell you all about it. They literally will tell you all about why they hate that country, their family, their community, why they hate it. And it'll be nothing personal. It'll be about the system, and it's fascinating to listen to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that you get born with a certain dominant characteristic, or does it change with your life?
This is one of those questions where I look around and say, how many learned professors are there in this room? Because I'm about to kill myself. This is my idea, speculation, please note, although it has some grounding. I believe that we enter this world with lenses, call them genetic lenses, through which we learn. Thus, all the learning is done and recorded memory, semantic and episodic memory. All of it is recorded in our memory, but it's recorded, which is the product of having traveled through a lens. So let's say I have a lot of that gene in me which predisposes me to be a risk taker, and I do. I know that every experience I've had since I was born is being had through that particular field of experience. So I do not believe that we can change our thinking style. I do not believe we can change that. I think what we can do is we can adapt how we use it. So I think part of our early experiences in life as we're growing up is this deeply painful, for sometimes deeply painful, adaptation process of how do I be me in the world that I was born into? Family, community, school, country. As we grow older, as we get older and we become more enabled, we have self-efficacy, we can choose our job, our parents are no longer telling us what to do with our laundry and how much we should be eating and what we should be wearing outside, all of these really good things. When that happens, we come into this world of reality. It suddenly says, how do I be me in this world given who I am? Because this world has some expectations and they're a heck of a lot worse than my parents' expectations were. So we go through another round of adaptation. I do not believe we change. I believe we adapt. I think that it is in us at birth. However, the nature part of it is a piece of it. All of the nurture part of it, what happens after we're born, is all of the content of it. And I don't think we would have an argument about these two things the last few hundred years if they both hadn't been true. Age of paradox, I think they're both true. I think content will adapt us, but nature gave us the lens. I'm speculating.
Here's all the way in the back. Yeah.
Run.
would have a question. Say, what if a person is like 50% past thinking and 50% future thinking? Would that lead to an inner conflict? For instance, like myself, I usually have a lot of ideas, but I'm always the last to buy a new gadget.
Good observation. Quick answer, yes. Yeah, it's funny. It seems that we are all born with our little burden. And we can understand that burden as being our thinking, because everything we do begins with a thought. Thus, all burdens originate in our thoughts. If we understand our thoughts, we can deal with the thinking. And you have a very good observation. You have past and future thinking. Now, by the way, 50-50? Not so much. You have to have some present thinking. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting here. You would have missed it. So let's assume that we have maybe 10% up north and we have the rest of it in this future and past. What that will do is it will actually, and this is the conflict that you will feel, it will have you see opportunities all the time. The ones that you go for, by the way, which are not going to be very many, you'll have lots of doubt that you did the right thing as soon as you've done it. But you will be compelled to look at those opportunities. And there's a sort of a real rub for you, because opportunity has a clock attached to it. Because opportunities don't last forever. So as the clock is ticking away and the door is closing or the window is closing on that opportunity, your level of anxiety, if you have a keen interest in it, if the content of the opportunity is important to you, your level of anxiety is going to go up. Because you will never have enough information to be certain. You can't. So yes, that is the paradox. That's the rub of the future and past thinking. What it also makes you, by the way, is deeply curious. So if you can hold back from beating yourself up for not having bought the house at the perfect time on the marketplace, it so happened in retrospect, if you can avoid beating yourself up for that, and you can also allow yourself to have a little bit more flight of fancy and not need to be absolutely certain before you get married or before something, because you're old and it's not so good anymore. It's learning, it's insight, it's learning how to deal with this, but understand that this is just your thinking. It's just your thinking system, it's your tools. It's not who you are. Okay.
I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
You just said that creators not only are identified within future thinking. You just said that.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't quite catch you.
That creators are not only identified within the future thinking.
Yes.
So could you give more insight on how creators relate to the system? Thereby, I mean artists or architects.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good question. So I'm going to make a differentiation between creativity and imagination. And of course, most of us think that imagination and creativity are synonymous, and I don't think they really are. If I take this glass and I throw it against that wall right now, and I won't, or maybe I will, I'll prove my point. No. If I took my glass and threw it up against that wall, I would create a mess. All right? That is still creative. What we have is a misunderstanding of the word creativity. Every human act is creative. It has never happened before. We are all creative beings all of the time. All of the time, never before, unique every single moment. So let's get this creativity thing clearly understood, which is there is creativity in science, in understanding things. There's creativity in planning and organizing things. And there's creativity in simply having ideas. There's different from imagination. Imagination is the capacity to leave where you are now and to travel into a space that does not exist. I was in Toronto a number of years ago, maybe 7 years ago, running a workshop for a very, very old, dear friend of mine. I mean, I've known him for a quarter of a century. And he has this wonderful company full of really, really, really cool people. And I, stupidly, it turned out, said, okay, so I want you to imagine, and you can imagine, it's a nice 2-day workshop, and I use this term, I want you to imagine. And there's a chap sitting at the back of the room, and he was just looking at me. And so I finished my little spiel about what I wanted them to imagine, because I wanted to do an exercise. And it's just sitting there, and he's still looking at me like this. And I go like, did I not make myself clear? And he go like, nope. I'm like, okay, let me try again. And I use the I word again. Please imagine. And he goes like, I get the problem. And I went, what's the problem? He says, I can't imagine. And I thought about this for a second, and you kind of go, everyone's sitting there like you are right now, expecting, what's he going to say? And I said, well, where are you on the map? He went, you know the line between present and past? I'm the dot on the line. So that's about as far away from future thinking as you can get. And I believe that future thinking is the potentiality of imagination. And again, it does not mean it's creativity. It simply means the ability to suspend what is real in front of you right now and to travel somewhere else in your mind. Invention. So I believe that you can look at art historically and you can see those artists who actually produced art that is photorealistic, probably past thinkers. Or the landscapes done of Holland in the mid-1800s, I think it was, in early mid-1700s to 1800s. These beautiful landscapes. Here's the village and things going on and the ducks walking around the pond. I believe that's present thinking at work, capturing the movement of day to day. And you go and look at a Jackson Pollock and you've only got to shrug your shoulders and say, he's got to be a future thinker because no one else understands it. So I think that one of the things that we need to be careful of in our age today is our use of words, imagination, creativity. We label things and we don't really understand what we mean by labeling them. And it's one of the things I think that we get in a lot of trouble with is when we don't really know what we mean and we don't say what we mean. And we're lazy with language and we end up in all kinds of trouble. So yeah, creativity is one of those words. It's a sticky word. But what I mean by creativity is what you've all been doing this evening and what we've been doing, what you're doing here. Learning, imagining, listening, understanding, exploring, asking questions, thinking. For all of which I thank you very much, actually.
Yeah.